welcome to Student Affairs Now. I'm your host, Susana Muñoz. Today, we're talking about a new and exciting book titled Identity-Conscious Supervision. I am thrilled that today we are joined by the three authors, scholar practitioners, and generally just fun people to hang out with. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We hope that you'll find these conversations make a contribution to the field and are restorative to the profession. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find us at studentaffairs.com or on Twitter at STUAffairsNow, ! As I mentioned, I'm Susana Muñoz. I'm an associate professor and program chair in the Higher Education Leadership Program at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. My pronouns are she, her, hers, ella. I'm hosting this conversation today from Fort Collins, Colorado. With respect, I want to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute Nations peoples. Now let's get into our conversation. We're here to discuss a new book titled Identity-Conscious Supervision in Student Affairs, Building Relationships and Transforming Systems with three of the authors. Please introduce yourselves and the relationship that you have to the topic.
Well, thank you so much for having us. My name is Rob Brown. My gender pronouns are he, him, and his, and I serve as the Director of Social Justice Education at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And I'm calling in today from Chicago. And in addition to that, I'm also a third-year doctoral student in the Higher Ed Leadership Program at Colorado State University. And so what kind of got me engaged in kind of doing this book is really my lens is both like a scholar and a practitioner. And so as a practitioner, I have been supervised, I am a supervisor, and it is super hard. It is just a very difficult thing. And I think as a supervisee, I don't know that I always understood that complexity, made sense of it until I was really in the role of a supervisor, particularly of professional staff. And so it's really through some early conversations with Shruti, who was my supervisor at one point in my career, that we started talking about some of those complexities and realized that more folks in our field needed to start having some of these conversations, particularly with a clear lens around inclusion and equity, which is kind of thinking in an alignment with my broader research interests in equity and inclusion in higher education. So through time, I've been able to partner with Shruti and Craig, who will introduce themselves in a moment, and have really been fortunate to continue to build really strong partnerships and collaborative relationships with them. But more importantly, just really strong friendships. So I'm excited to join you all today.
Thank you. Sure, Shruti.
Thanks, Rob. And thank you for having us today to talk about this. And just, it's always a great opportunity to spend time with Craig and Rob, so I always appreciate that. My name is Shruti Desai. I use she, her pronouns. I serve as Chief of Staff for the Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement at Washington University in St. Louis. And I'm on the academic side of the house, so a little bit different of a lens. And as Rob mentioned, we went on a supervision journey together, and in that had a lot of conversations about identity. And as identity is important to me, equity and justice work is really important to me. I always felt some dissonance between the way that I was told to supervise, the way we did performance evaluations, promotions, merit raises, and my values around identity and inclusion and justice. And when I started interrogating that a little bit with the team that I worked with, we found that a lot of us were struggling with this. I think you couple that with the retention and job satisfaction and mental health, more and more challenges that professionals who have marginalized identities face. There's a clear need in our field to talk about supervision. And a lot of times people leave jobs not because they don't like the work that they're doing, but because they don't like environments and managers. And I think we have a lot of work to do and a lot of growth that could happen in our field around that intersection.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Yeah, just echo, thank you for being here, for having us here today, and love time with Rob and Shruti. Every time we get to do this, it's a joy. So yeah, my name is Craig Elliott. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I currently serve as the Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs at Samuel Merritt University in Oakland, California, and also have a leadership role in ACPA as well. Yeah, just this was a journey. I think we talked about, so there's so many stories in the book from our own experiences of the okay supervisory experiences, the handful of really good ones that we had, but a lot of really challenging experiences that we had along the way. And you know, this, I mean, I share with Shruti and Rob about this kind of motivation that I had about I wanted to do better. In my supervisory experiences, you know, it was a lot of on-the-job learning, identity was always at play, and I never knew how to engage it meaningfully in the relationship, so that kind of drove me to being a part of having these conversations with Rob and Shruti. But I also say I knew it was something for us. That was our motivation for doing presentations and writing this book. But I'm still surprised about how much of a need it is out there for others. The demand out there and the continued conversations about people needing help engaging race and gender and orientation in class and ability, and how all those things play out in our lives, but very specifically in a supervisor relationship, and how there's lots of challenge and fear there, but also the potential for transformation. This could be a really powerful relationship in our lives if we all did our work to have that happen. So there's some really great positive hopefulness that has come out of this for us as well. So just great to be here and be in conversation with y'all.
This is awesome. And I love that this, you know, this kind of stems from personal experiences that you've all had. And you're absolutely correct. Like I remember being, you know, in my practitioner role and not necessarily getting a lot of guidance around supervision. But I kind of want to understand a little bit about sort of your sort of where you sort of enter in the conversation in terms of personally. And so Rob, like, can you explain what motivated you to write this book and from sort of a personal sense and why you feel it's important in the fields of student affairs and higher education?
So, so just in like full authenticity, right? We did not go into this sitting down saying we want to write a book, you know, and I think some of that is rooted in our backgrounds as practitioners. Some of that is rooted in some class dynamics. I mean, just the notion of I'm going to write a book was not in my consciousness. And so as I kind of gained some motivation to write this book, a lot of it came through doing what I'm more, you know, apt to do, which is present. And so, you know, Shruti and I, and then Craig joined, we were presenting on this topic with practitioners. And as we were engaging with them, there was this hunger that we were receiving from them for more. Like, we want more, like we need this, more people need to be talking about this. And so some of the motivation just came out of a need to be responsive. And then an invitation, right, from Routledge, our editors, to think about, and I think in some ways that invitation from them was immensely validating for me to think about this as a scholarly endeavor and a practical one. And then as we actually just kind of got into the outlining and the brainstorming process with each other, you know, Shruti, Craig, and I are very much so grounded that this needs to be both kind of a head and heart exercise. So kind of how can we think about this intellectually, but also how have our own lived experiences really informed the lens in which we kind of experienced the need for this text. And as I reflected on that personally, you know, I am the youngest professional like of this group, and so just in my young career as a Black man working in student affairs, I often have navigated isolation around those identities and finding community, finding mentorship. That was a big aspect of my supervisory relationship with Shruti, and kind of what started getting this ball rolling of kind of how does identity play out in this role of supervision. And you know, there's really like two real, I think, seminal moments that have validated the need for me to write this book. And I think one was with Shruti and talking about this need for kind of Black male mentorship, and why I couldn't find that at the university in which we were working, and really leaning on her for that as a supervisor. And at one point in our conversations, I think she was really great about like hearing that and wanting to connect me with colleagues and folks that she knew who could provide that type of lens and support. And then after a while, as I kept pushing, you know, she, you know, rightly so, pushed back on me and shared like, you know, well, what am I to you? And I think in that moment, I was like, whoa, totally like missing and erasing the mentorship that I'm receiving from Shruti as another person of color, woman of color, who has shown up and held so much space for me to process through my identities. And so even just to think about identity with more complexity in the context of supervision was kind of one motivator. The second experience that really stuck with me came after our time working together. And I was working in multicultural affairs, where identity is so constant, as you know, you work to support students and campus. And you know, it was about 5 years ago, you know, I was making sense of the murder of Eric Gardner, and was just sitting in my office alone one day and watching this video. You know, that first time that we heard I Can't Breathe, and was just at a loss and at such a low point, personally, professionally, but was in my center, sitting in my office. And that same evening, there was, you know, students quickly organized and there was a vigil. And as a staff member, I got asked to attend that vigil. By my supervisor and their supervisor, to show student support, to be present. And as I got out there and I was gonna, you know, just be there to be in solidarity and supporting students as they navigated kind of whatever might come up, standing out there in the cold, I just started like crying, you know, myself personally. And in that moment, I was like, God, why did no one tell me I should not be here? Why did no one see me that night, right? As both a human and a student affairs professional, right? And I think it is in that memory, like it still lands on me so heavy. And I know that there are so many practitioners as we, just this week, right? Who had to sit and make sense of Breonna Taylor's loss and continued injustice and go to work and pretend and kind of operate as business as usual in the way that we have corporatized higher education. And I think that feeling that I feel that I can relate into with so many practitioners in this work, particularly people of color, but I think this work shows up around marginalization in so many different ways. You know, created the motivation where this book had to be written, not to fix all of that, but at least to speak some level of truth into that void. And so that continues to be remotivating, and I find myself, as we continue to talk to folks about the book, that continues to be a major point of dialogue that folks are starting to reckon with and make sense of.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you for showing up as you are in your authenticity. And I think what you've discussed is super real in terms of what we're navigating in these times. And in your book, you do talk about racial battle fatigue, and how you bring in critical race theory in terms as tenets to look at sort of our leadership models or forces of leadership. What do other folks think about sort of how we're navigating our current times, given the importance of this book?
Yeah. Okay, I'll go next. So just, and Rob, just beautiful. I just want to acknowledge the emotions and the feelings and you know, I think we spent a lot of time together, and I'm still moved by that experience that you shared. And you know, I think it reminds me of, and you know, I appreciate how too we brought it back to Breonna Taylor about how like it has not eased up. And I don't know that it ever has, but I think in this last 5 years, it's been such a visceral experience of racism, and how that's infused in our country and our campuses, in our profession, and just how omnipresent it is. And I think what I love about what Rob shared is that we're trying to, I think we had a vision, a hope, if you will, about bringing the humanity back to what we do and who we are in our roles. And there's no question that I think any of us here, and probably lots of our professionals, see our work as in connecting with students' humanity, but there is a clear gap in us connecting with each other's humanity, and often how our institutions see us as employees on our campuses. And I think, you know, same thing. It's like, you're here to do a job, go do it. And you know, this kind of, and what we ended up calling this identity neutral way of engagement and way of relating with each other does so much harm and perpetuates so much pain and creates trauma. But you know, I think about the invisibility of our colleagues, our friends and colleagues that are giving their hearts and souls to care for students and educate them, and be some good positive force in their lives, and in our campuses and our leaders, and we, like, you know, I hold myself into that because I've done that more than I care to admit. But how we forget to see who's working with us in our tasks. Because of how we're trained, because of how the system works, because of how we're taught, we're onboarded, we're normalized, and told how to show up on our campuses in higher education. And you know, I think it's so frustrating and hurtful, and I'm angry. You know, there's a lot of, we spent a lot of time processing through kind of all of our feelings and do this, but just this anger that it was, you know, almost 30 years into my professional career before I was able to have meaningful conversations about identity in my role on campus, and holding it in terms of supervision, but also as an AVP and an administrator on a campus, and what that means, and how do I show up with, and you know, those are the interesting things. Like, the showing up with is a whole different paradigm. Unfortunately, it's a whole different paradigm for what we've been given. And I think Rob talked about that. It's go show up for, rather than the show up with. So it's, you know, I think that the humanity, bringing the humanity back, and the hope, because I still, you know, like, I think we still believe deeply in what we do, and as educators and as practitioners, and caring professionals that, you know, higher education can change the world. We can be a part of that transformation. We can help be really positive sparks for our students in all of their identities. And so this was a part of us trying to help make that happen.
Awesome. I feel that the emotion of that this was a labor of love, but also deep emotion for everyone. And I honor that, and I think that's a beautiful thing that we don't necessarily see in student affairs scholarship, is bringing your full present self in the work, right? And so I appreciate that. And Shruti, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the way Craig ended of just, we gotta find a way to get some hope. And I'm reading one of Brene Brown's books, and I know she's complicated, but talks about hope as a skill set. And I think we forget that. I think we just want hope to be this ideology or this intrinsic thing, but it is really a practice skill over and over again of, I gotta stay hopeful. And I you know, if I saw Craig walking down the street, I'd be like, who's this like progressive hippie white guy? And not even like engage in conversations, but being in relationship with him, I'm able to have a little bit of hope that there are white folks in student affairs who are doing the work, who are trying to change systems. Rob, as a straight Black man, is always like, Shruti, you're like undervaluing yourself. You gotta, and so we advocate for each other in a way that disrupts these systems, that disrupts the messages that we've internalized. And I think that what we sometimes want to do in student affairs and in higher education is fix things without doing the hard, painful work of internal reconciliation. And I think I've been in St. Louis for about 10 years now, and was here when Michael Brown was shot and killed, and have had several incidents since then. And I remember the first time Michael Brown was shot and killed, the list of demands from students. And I remember now the George Floyd list of demands from students. And it is so frustrating to me, because when are we as higher education and as student affairs going to reconcile ourselves with the values that we impose, the values that we espouse, and the work that we're actually doing, right? And it is like, hey, Shruti, you're queer, why don't you go serve on the LGBT advisory board? Cool, I don't want to do that. I want to come home to my partner and hang out with my dogs and or compensate me for doing that. And I feel also, I think we feel responsible of, I want this to be better for our students, and I want this to be better for our next generation. And so there's this constant like conflict of values that is occurring. And it's been interesting to watch as we're doing a series at work called Two Pandemics. One is the COVID pandemic and one is the racism pandemic. And it's been interesting to watch the university, across universities, of who's presidents and deans and vice presidents all really being in the weeds of COVID because people are dying. But when it comes to racism and people are dying, it's not the same response. And I'm like, do we not see that people are dying because of racism and transphobia and classism and all of these other things? So I keep waiting and hoping for higher ed to have some reconciliation around this. And I see people leaving, our brilliant scholars leaving our field. And if they're leaving our field, I just wonder what's next for our newer professionals. Are we going to be able to keep doing work that really is impactful to our students? And I know for many of us, we're called to and love what we do, and we're also frustrated and want more from our institutions.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that, particularly sort of like the discrepancy in labor and who's doing the work. In my class last night in student development, we talked about this notion of agency, right? For students, it's a readily used concepts, but at what point is that labor for students that is seen as an additional burden that they have to endure on our college campuses? And yes, we see these lists and demands, and it's all sort of led by students. We sort of, guise it under this sense of agency, but it's also labor that they probably didn't have to do if our campuses were just and humane spaces, right? And so I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation. And Shruti, I wanted to also talk a little about this concept of courageous leadership and how that gets enacted into the supervision. I really resonated with that. And I'm wondering if you can even talk about it. What does that look like in the academic affairs? How does that get talked about or practiced or implemented and enacted? So if you can say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the beauty of academic affairs is tenure, right? Faculty just have more agency and voice, and because of tenure. And so some of our biggest advocates, we had a panel last night about the debate, and the faculty members we had on it had the opportunity to explicitly name, this is racist, this is classist, this is, and I think staff and students, we have to walk a little bit more of a tightrope because we don't have that backing or the support that we're not going to lose our jobs, that we're not going to be suspended. And I think our students have a little bit more agency, but still they struggle with, I need to get a job when I leave here. I want to be hired, particularly our students from low income backgrounds who have a lot more on the line and don't have like the network of their parents and their grandparents and their whatever. But I think when we can partner when student affairs and academic affairs can partner, I think there's a stronger voice that is given to some of these topics and some of the change that needs to happen on our campuses. Faculty have clear research and clear kind of critical thought and access to the provost differently than the average student affairs person does. And I think that the piece around tenure, when you can really partner with them and ask them to leverage their voice, that makes a huge difference. But I also think that that's how dollars are brought in, particularly on a campus like mine, that the med school and the research brings in huge dollars for the university. And I think we'd be fooling ourselves to say that doesn't matter. It does matter. Where the money is and how it's coming into universities is really important. And so if we can also leverage that, I think that starts to get on the radar of chancellors and presidents and board of trustees differently than students who are making demands, who have been making demands for the last 4, 8, 10, 12, 20 years. So I think if that's an area that I think universities can continue to grow and learn in.
Thank you. Anybody want to add anything?
I just, Shruti talked about the courage with the power dynamics on campus and how to navigate that. I also think this idea of, for me as a white male, straight white male practitioner, it's also in for those of us in our dominance identities about having the courage to lead these conversations and to start them. Because I think the way we navigate through some of the power dynamics and the fear and the lack of protection that some people on our campuses have is we're supervisors helping lead some of that. And I think as I'm working with new professionals coming in to work with me, I think it's us establishing that this is part of what our relationship is. But sometimes it's also for me to show up and say what needs to be said. In a one-on-one conversation in the hallway on campus, when we used to go on campus and have conversations in the hallway, or in the meeting. White people we don't have good practice in this. And so there's a lot of fear of making mistakes in this whiteness. There's a lot of training that comes with that we have to unlearn. And I also want to acknowledge that if we've not had these conversations before, they're really hard to start. And so one of the things I think that we did a great job with is just saying we have to start where you are, be messy, but try to do the good work in the moment. People will see that and hold that more than the fumbling and the mess that you make. And so we want practitioners, and especially those with dominant identities, to be courageous, to start having these conversations and have identity be an appropriate and an effective part of the relationship, because it matters.
Yeah, I like how you brought up too that, you know, this notion of fear and the lack of protection. I don't think we have enough conversations about that. That just climate in itself impacts identity and how we show up. And so I'm happy that you brought that up. Rob, did you want to add anything to this?
I would just echo that. I think in what Craig is sharing is that there's a vulnerability required that we are contextualizing supervision in that I think traditional hegemonic notions of supervision, it's top down. It's like, you do for me, I make the rules, I have all the answers. And I think we are trying to move from that kind of one direction supervision relationship to an actual relationship that is co-constructed and power aware, right? And so there's a giving up, there's a vulnerability that's kind of required within that. One other thing that I would say that, you know, our book attempts to maybe start having folks think about is, how are you also courageous beyond the individual relationship and advocating for change within your department, within the broader like human resources system at your institution. So it's great if you individually support me. That's wonderful. And if there is not broader structural change that that is increasing access to employment, that is putting equitable policies in place, that is ultimately going to either cause folks to leave the university or to never find their home at your university. And so as supervisors, depending on like your level of positionality and power and influence, I think that's another place where kind of we prompt practitioners to think about courage in that context, to intervene and to advocate at that broader level as well.
Yeah, I totally vibe with that. I think, you know, the courage, you know, application to systemic change, to transformational change. Again, you know, we focus on sort of sometimes these band-aid approaches to higher education, right? But not really looking at it systemically in the institutional legacy that we have to really address in these conversations. So I appreciate that. And Craig, as someone, you know, who is, you know, the leader of one of the, you know, National Student Affairs Associations, ACPA, you know, how does this book maybe transform, you know, climate? You know, we talked a little bit about sort of, you know, notions of fear and, you know, this lack of protection. You know, how does our associations, you know, utilize this book to transform our campuses?
Yeah, it was, and I would say too, so the answer I think we're talking about, it's systemic change, changing, and really part 3 of the book talks about the systems change work that we need to do, and both you and Rob also talked about it as well. And I don't, when we started presenting and when we started writing, this was not yet something that was formed. We knew that work had to be done at the individual level, the self-work and the work of relationships. But also, as Rob talked about, the courageous part about showing up in our representative roles, in our groupness, both in our professional roles, but also in our identities and who we are on our campus. But really, once we started to do that, we quickly began to understand that we can't be stopping there. We're here to do good work. Social justice asks us to change the system and, you know, not just resist oppression, but transform the environment so that oppression doesn't continue to happen, which is liberation. And so for us, really, we came into it with a liberatory mindset. And this is too where I think it's important, this idea of critical hope that Shruti talked about, that we believe that there is a possible thing out there. And it's not a naive hope. But it's a critical one to say it's gonna be a hard road, and we're gonna encounter resistance all along the way. And I mean, you look at this week, last week, the month before, we're getting all kinds of resistance. And so how are we continuing to do our good work collectively, individually, but then collectively to create this change? And so I think that, so I think this book gives us an opportunity. It is not the only way to bring liberation in higher education or on our campus or in our divisions, but it's a way. And we clearly saw the path that changing the way that we supervising from an identity conscious way and authentically and vulnerability can lead us to create opportunities for that transformation on our campuses and in the profession. You know, I think it's, you know, connecting the work that we did here with the work that we've been doing in ACPA for many years. It started with Donna Lee and continued with Stephen Quay and Jamie Washington and myself, and then Vernon Wall now. This strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization. That's a huge map, a vision, a critical hope for transformation for higher education. And it's massive. And there's so many different elements of that. Their piece that they wrote was brilliant. And interestingly, there's a lot of similarities there about, you know, love in the center that they wrote in, which is our relationships are the center too, and what we would also all say is love. Also, but there's a path for that, and so one of the ways that we offered through this book is supervision is a key part about that. And I will say too, it's inspiration for me individually and me refining my own practice, but it's inspiration for me too to be a part of this change energy and to be a part of liberation on our campuses, that professionals that follow us, you know, I hope we're influencing professionals to change now, but really the ripple that we put in place is going to be for the generations that are going to follow us. And so for us to be one small part of this bigger movement that eventually transforms higher education, so that it's a learning environment that allows every student who comes through to thrive, to find exactly what they need to be wonderfully challenged and grow, but for them to thrive and find their purpose and go out and to make their ripple out in the world. And so, you know, so it's a big thing. And I think I wish we had 4 more volumes to talk about the change work that we wanted to do. And we also knew that it was important that we started here, that we didn't get lost in the big picture, but we talked about the really critical work that we can do on a daily basis for supervision that makes a huge difference. And I would say at that micro level, that if we can transform that experience of professionals coming to work and doing great, excellent work on our campuses, that's a huge difference that it makes. And that directly changes people's lives, so that we can then continue to partner and change our students' lives.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, you know, one of the things that I know I will be doing is assigning this book in our graduate program, because I think this is really a great way to not only influence sort of our professionals and rethinking how, you know, we center love and hope as we navigate higher education, but it's so needed. It's so needed. And so I'm hoping that other programs will follow suit and assign this book in their programs. And so we're at our last question. I just kind of want to ask, this program is called Student Affairs Now. So what are you pondering or questioning or troubling now? And so I'll start with Rob. I know, put you on the spot a little bit.
Thanks for putting me on the spot.
Yeah, it's all love.
So I know. A lot. I guess I'm trying to track my energy as I trouble is definitely up for me now. But beyond that, I think about, how do we have the work that we are doing in higher education truly responsive to the voices of our students and our youth, knowing that that is who will fill the halls, the Zoom rooms of higher education. And so much of what I am seeing and hearing from them is this statement that like things do not have to be the way they are, which is, I think, just a powerful statement of resistance, but also a statement of hope and possibility. And as I reflect on my work, as I engage with those students, as I engage with other scholars and practitioners, I am often wondering and pondering kind of what in our ecosystems within higher education doesn't need to be the way it is now. And realizing that that is something that we have control and agency around, right? And so what comes up in that context is rejecting fear at times, like that sometimes comes up, rejecting the unknown, and how that comes up, rejecting scarcity, that puts us into these false binaries of choices that we need to make, and then really leaning into possibility, and the wisdom that we can learn both from youth, but also from elders, right? There are folks who have done this work before. There is radical transformation happening right now in the present that we can be students of and become students of. And so that's really where I'm investing my energy, is kind of where am I seeing radical truth tellers, folks engaged in the practice of transformation, folks engaging with a sense of kind of radical hope. And I am like running as fast as I can to those spaces, those people, those forms of literature, and trying to consume that energy as a way of looking forward. And I think there's so much of that happening right now, even as we are in the midst of what is an incredible mess in our nation, in our world, in higher education, and on our campuses. And so from an energy standpoint, I can only consume so much of that mess, right?
Right.
Before, it starts to bog me down a little bit. And so finding those glimmers amidst the storm has been something that I am looking to ponder, to question, to seek out in the now.
I love that. Thank you, Rob. Shruti, what about you?
Yeah, I don't get to spend that much time with students anymore, but I pay a lot of attention to newer professionals in our field. And as a South Asian woman, thinking about who role modeled and paved paths for us, I think about Mamta Akapati, Ajay Nair, Smita Razika, Shadia. And so there's folks ahead, but there's only 4 or 5 folks ahead. And I know that what they've gone through to get into these vice president, vice chancellor, dean of students positions, and the pain that they went through and the things that they had to listen to, and how many times they were told no and had struggled with imposter syndrome. And for that generation, being kids of immigrants, the whole notion of healing and mental health and therapy were not palatable things. And I look at this generation, particularly of South Asian professionals who are coming, and I see them valuing themselves, even when the system is saying you're not valuable. And I think that's when the power and the shift and the healing happens, because we've done our own work, because we are investing in ourselves, because we know that there's a lot of lies out there around who matters and around whose work matters, and how people are compensated, and who gets promoted and who gets published and who doesn't. And I think people are finding, particularly, I'm not that old, but like particularly the generation behind me, who's saying, yes, and I still matter. Yes, and I'm still going to get published. Yes, and I'm still going to get promoted. And I'm going to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And I think that that's really powerful. And I think that's going to help us help students and increase our retention and increase our pipeline for students from low SES and students of color. And that's hopeful. And I keep waiting, and we'll keep waiting for a reconciliation. But the generation behind us and the generation ahead of me gives me hope that this reconciliation for higher education is coming. And it's going to be one way or another, either through our finances, through our board of trustees, through enrollment dips. It's going to become more than just we need to do diversity inclusion work. It's going to be, in order to survive, in order to be relevant, in order to admit students and get students here, this has to be in the ethos of what we do day to day. And I am excited about that. And I see institutions already moving in that direction. And sometimes taking a few steps back, but continuing to fight and move forward in those ways. And I, as presidents retire and new presidents come along, there's going to be some change, and I am really excited about that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Craig, how about you? What are you pondering?
Yeah. So I would say I appreciate what Shruti said about the pandemics. And so I'm pondering about how do our institutions engage the pandemic of racism and the pandemic of sexism and misogyny and the pandemic of trans oppression and the others with the same kind of resources and the same attention and the same fervor that they've done with the pandemic of COVID. And I know we're struggling to keep balance with that it's easier for us to engage about the health crisis of COVID than the health crisis of racism. And so I'm wanting us to bring equity, bring that same kind of attention to addressing racism and sexism and transphobia and hate of all kinds on our campuses with that same attention. And I think it also reminds me too that I think, so I'm wanting professionals to be a part of those efforts. And there's so much we can do right now. So it also reminds me of do what you can. We all have spheres of influence, as Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about. So use your sphere of influence to make a difference and to create that change work. And for those of us that are supervisors, there's work there for us to be able to do. For those of us who are being supervised, all of us are being supervised by somebody, we can then begin to initiate those conversations and to bring about this critical hope and this critical liberation that all of us have talked about. Our students deserve this, our upcoming professionals deserve this, our campuses deserve this. And so just for the call to action for all of us to show up and start addressing all of these pandemics, not just some of them.
That's brilliant. I love that their reconciliation towards liberation, finding glitters of hope and really addressing that, the pandemic of racism. I think those are awesome last thoughts. I am grateful for all of your time today as guests on Student Affairs Now. You can receive reminders about this and other episodes by subscribing to the Student Affairs Now newsletter or browse our archives at studentaffairsnow.com. Please subscribe to the podcast and invite others to subscribe, share on social media, or leave a 5-star review. It really helps the conversation like this reach more people and build a community so we can continue to make this free for you. Again, I'm Susana Muñoz. I want to really thank our fabulous guests today and everyone who is watching, listening, to be kind to yourselves and make it a great week. Thank you.